Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction. The panel will be in English, ladies and gentlemen. So if you'd like to switch to Turkish in interpretation, I will take my time introducing our speakers.
It's my privilege to share this panel with two esteemed colleagues. Today, I have with me Gemma Aiolfi, who is the head of compliance at the Corporate Governance and Collective Action Center within the Basel Institute on Governance. And I have Professor Nikos Passas. Nikos is a true son of the Mediterranean who has lost his way and found himself in the US. He's a professor at Northeastern University. Gemma and Nikos are acclaimed names in the global compliance community. They are esteemed colleagues and very dear friends to me. Gemma, Nico, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us on.
Well, I know that we haven't been using our time quite properly, so I will dive into questions right away. And I will reshuffle the questions, so because I know that Nikos has an appointment elsewhere. But anyway, I will start with you, Gemma, and I will ask you the ultimate question. What is conscious capitalism? Is it a new concept? Is it even useful?
Thank you very much, Tayfun. Thank you for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to join you and a great honor. And thank you, Nikos, for being a little bit patient. I know you have to run away, but let's see if we can get started quite quickly. So conscious capitalism, reinventing capitalism, is it new? Sounds new. But I think it's been around for a few years. It's not really completely new. One of the founders described it as the innate potential of business to make a positive impact on the world. And it's possible to serve, align, and integrate the interests of all major stakeholders. And profits are also good and acknowledged as necessary and part of what a conscious capitalism is all about. And it's all about, it seems, awareness of the company within the world. I'm also a little bit wary of saying anything too critical, because I know that Nikos's university also offers courses on this, and he probably is more of an expert on it. But to me, it sounds very much like the stakeholder model that has been discussed for some years already, perhaps with another name that's quite catchy, almost like a marketing phrase that has been designed to hook in consumers. Because in a way, if you look at the companies that are propagating this concept most actively, perhaps, they tend to be very close to their consumers. It's Whole Foods, Nestle, Danone, food groups that clearly are sometimes under pressure to respond to consumer demands. Companies that are further removed from that pressure, immediate consumer pressure, are perhaps more difficult to integrate into this notion unless there are other ways of doing it. Most of those are perhaps subjected to NGO pressure rather than direct consumer pressure. So the claims that stakeholders can also be integrated and don't have conflicting interests is perhaps something that can be open to challenge. Is it useful? Then I think there are tensions between suppliers wanting high prices, consumers wanting low prices, employees wanting high wages, communities wanting clean water, clean air. Clearly, these are tensions. Perhaps some of them can be resolved within the conscious capitalism definition, but perhaps some of them are more difficult to do that. So companies make trade-offs. They make trade-offs all the time. They do so through risk assessments, through market pressures, through requirements by law and regulation. And clearly, one of the rationale for companies is to make profits. And there's an argument to be said that it's the shareholders that own the company, and therefore they should be the ones who should decide what happens to a company and how it should be changed. And in reality, we are seeing that, I think, with changes in non-financial reporting standards, with the way that investors have evolved their positions over the years. And if you look back, so 20, 30, 40 years ago, and how things have changed, even within our memories and lifetimes, and perhaps that's showing how old I am. But if you think back some years, corporate social responsibility investing involved excluding certain categories like tobacco from investment portfolios. And then came along environment and social and governance investing, which was aligning the social objectives and the financial objectives of a company. And then we've got, and now perhaps that's where we're at the moment, is impact investing. So you see major investors divesting from coal or fossil fuels, like the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund or BlackRock and its pronouncements. So we're in a state of evolution. So is it useful? Yes, it's useful as a way of identifying how things are emerging and changing and how companies are responding to that. But I think companies respond as much to investor decisions as perhaps, in certain sectors anyway, as perhaps to consumer preferences and so on. There's lots more to be said, but I won't take the floor for much longer so that Nikos can have a say too. Thank you, Tayfun, for the first question.
Thank you, Gemma. Well, Nico, again, we are sorry for not being able to use your time properly. Let me dive into the questions, and I will merge my first two questions for you together. But we all know that the economic models, although new, they are big engines, they are big machines with a lot of moving parts, and the biggest of those parts are governments and regulators. Where do you put governments and regulators in this economic model? And we see a sharp rise in the influence of the executive offices, even in the most, or arguably the most advanced democracies. Do you think the leaders are ready for this economic transition? Do you think they will let this transition happen?
Well, it is nice to try and endow capitalism with consciousness. It's a good aspirational target, but look at the normality that brought us to where we are now. Just take a look at the current crisis. As far as preparedness was concerned, did the current stakeholder arrangements and leadership pay sufficient attention to intrusions in nature and trade in endangered species? Did it focus research and investment on the coming coronaviruses? Did it stock up in protective equipment, ventilators, and hospital capacity? Did it build adequate healthcare systems in order to deal with the coming crisis that everyone had forecast? When it hit us, did we share data fast and openly? Did we guide the public in proper conduct? Did we boost confidence in institutions and science? Did we coordinate treatments, vaccines meaningfully and globally? Are we paving the ground for the next pandemic? My fear is that, and the risks that we need to consider is that the inequalities and problems that are being exaggerated are not being helped by some of the state interventions that we have right now. Look at state central banks driving financial markets to record highs when hundreds of millions of people are suffering, leading to artificial pricing, leading to bubbles, leading to zombie markets, and junkie investors are dependent on state intervention. Instead of the proverbial tide that lifts all the boats, what we have is a tsunami that lifts only well-placed yachts and overturns the smaller vessels. And the yachts may be doing well, but we have devastation all around us. The 10 richest persons made enough to pay for vaccination of the entire Earth population, and $1 trillion was made by the top earners in the United States during the pandemic. In the midst of all this, the ILO is warning us about massive job losses. The World Food Organization is talking about massive hunger. WHO is telling us about vaccine nationalism. Others are using terms like biological warfare, the vaccines and how they're being used, modern piracy, and essentially all forms of protectionism. The balance between state and private stakeholders is not ideally worked out. This capitalism wears no clothes. It has a nose to smell near-term profits and benefits, but has no eyes to see beyond its nose and what happens in the medium and long term. So the question is, are we producing ideologies, neoliberalism, for example, that pretend to be keys to history, but turn out to be ways of escaping responsibility and accountability? Perhaps neo-socialism, for the very few, is a better descriptor of what we have in place. And at the same time, what we have is massive amounts of money coming and printing, quantitative easing and interventions in the state. And we have deglobalization risks to consider, trade shrinking due to extreme debt at all levels, national, company, and households, populism and onshoring of supply chains and production. We have lobbying from inefficient industries and conducive to favoritism. And we have big firms becoming even more dominant. We have governments becoming more oversized, and therefore risks of corruption and graft in oligarchic contexts. The cost of compliance to new rules and regulations may go up. The productivity may go lower. Slowdown in economies is another risk. Potential supply chain and food disruptions, social unrest, and growth of demand and supply asymmetries. Those are the kinds of things in a context of possible international cooperation hesitancy and weakening of international norms and institutional frameworks. These are the risks that we need to address, and these are the tasks that leadership from all stakeholders demand attention. So to give you some answers, because I will have to leave in just a few minutes, the answer, the approach that I would suggest, and I will leave it to Gemma to walk you through all of this, is how do you incentivize, again, how do we rearrange the stakeholders, their respective roles and responsibilities, and how, in essence, do we make the interests appear and be clearly common? The path on which we are with inequality and other trends that we have is unsustainable. So we have to point out the sustainability limitations and show that the self-interest in the medium term is harmed. We cannot afford goods and services that we sell if the rest of the world is going under. You cannot designate a corner of the swimming pool as a toilet and expect that it's going to be clear swimming in the rest of it. The same problem is with the climate crisis. You cannot have pockets of cleanness and pollution, droughts, fires, and sea surges. The same thing with pandemic, that is everyone's concern. You cannot have herd immunity in one country and disease in another. Otherwise, variants and continuing disruptions are going to be with us for the foreseeable future, shrinking the market and undermining economic growth. What we need, therefore, is science with conscience, society and capitalism with conscience. We need openness, peer review, risk-based prioritization of research and investment and development, going for the common good. And on the other side, we need a collective wisdom based on science. We need conscience with science against misinformation, disinformation, populism, and all the problems that everyone is dealing with. So science with conscience, conscience with science. If you take science out of conscience, you're left with a con. No integrity, undermined democracy, a lower quality of life. So it is up to us to make it good with values-based compliance, solutions geared collective initiatives that take the solution to the problem and build it into the business model of corporations that need to make profit, better metrics based on outcomes rather than outputs, and a better balance of private, public, and social organization roles. And I apologize for the time that I took, but I have to run.
It was all yours. Thank you very much indeed. I hope to see you soon in another event, or hopefully after this pandemic, we will meet face to face, share a drink, share ideas.
Absolutely.
Until then.
Absolutely. And by the way, I am in the United States, but in Boston, the Athens of the North, the Athens of America.
Yeah, you are. Parapoli. Cheers. Well, Gemma, we are a panel of two now, with a lot of ideas to discuss and to digest. We were, I think, under the delusion saying that although we have our differences, when there is an alien attack, we will all come together and forget about our differences and fight together. About a year ago, there was an alien attack from within the world, and we didn't fight. We didn't fight together. We didn't forget our differences. We didn't lift our barriers. And Nikos has given us a wake-up call about that. So, from where he left, we have opened up with you with a strong question and asked ourselves whether conscious capitalism was even useful. And now I will come back to you and say, do we have good examples, at least, in corporate governance, in compliance? Because I know that we have enough bad examples in that area. Do you think there is also good examples? Do you have good examples to give us in the business world so that we can hold on to them and look for a brighter future for us?
Thank you. Thank you to Nikos, although he's gone for his also tsunami of ideas. And as he was talking, maybe I can just comment a little bit so that we have a bit of a bridge to your question. As he was talking, it reminded me how he listed out all the terrible developments that we've seen, the negativity that we've seen in the last year or so, and all the, if you like, the bad things that have resulted that have come out of the pandemic and everything. And I wouldn't disagree with most of what he said, or even all of what he said, but it also reminded me of how we talked about corruption some years ago, in that it was this insidious, terrible plague that infected everything. And if we all remember the opening words of the UN Convention Against Corruption, it undermines markets, it hurts the weakest, it affects every element of society. And when you read those words and when you think about the state of the world, it starts to all look very bleak and very hopeless. And when the problem is so massive that it needs so many things to make it right, it's too much to start thinking about how can we ever change anything. The temptation is, because it's such a massive problem, there's nothing we can do, that helplessness sets in and resignation, and what's the point, because we're all damned and going to hell in a handcart anyway. But we mustn't lose hope. And I think it's also very important to remember some of the good things and think about the positives and think about what we can change within our own ways of working and with what we are good at doing. So while I respect what Nikos said, I think it's also one side of the story. And it's certain, one thing is certain, is that the future is uncertain, but that has always been the case. And the world has seen plagues and pandemics before and has come out better. So we have an opportunity. Now, this has also developed into quite a few catchy phrases, the Great Reset, the Build Back Better, and so on. They don't necessarily make things clearer for anybody. So what do I think at the end of it all? I think we have to be optimistic where we can be. I think we don't have to give up. I don't think we have to resign. I think we have to believe in our institutions where they do work. Whatever happened in the US recently, in the end, democracy has triumphed. the institutions that were regarded as being fundamentally weakened still prevailed. And so people tend to dwell on the negative and what's gone wrong and what's terrible, but also there is the positive side. When we look at the pandemic, the development of a vaccine for a very complicated illness within 1 year, and to be rolled out on such a scale for millions of people at the same time, is phenomenal. The world has never seen anything like it. And it uses groundbreaking technology in the way, that's probably not the right word, but the way that it attacks the virus. So these are amazing human achievements that would not have been considered possible even a year and a half ago. I remember hearing, I think, David Nabarro from the World Health Organization saying quite seriously, and he's an expert, we will need 4 years for a vaccine. And he turned out to be wrong. And it all happened much more quickly. Now, sure, there's vaccine nationalism, there's all the things that have gone wrong, but let's just hold on to the phenomenal human achievement that made it happen. So, just trying to redress the balance there a little bit before we all go out and weep and do nothing because it's all too hopeless. So, in terms of good examples, well, let's look for a moment what everybody's talking about: climate change, sustainability, and all those big ideas that are so fundamentally important and have been brought to the forefront by what has happened in the last year. The importance of how connected we all are to each other, how connected we are to nature and to the climate, to the planet, and so on. And are companies doing something about it? Is there something changing? And is there some hope? Well, I think there are areas of hope. And even if there are pockets of hope that are not grand enough in scale for Nikos, I think that they are green shoots that should be nurtured. So if you look at the EU's Green Deal, now the EU is by no means a perfect institution, and there are some in my home country who would definitely agree with that, but it's not my personal view. I think that the force for good that has been the EU has been tremendous. And they've sometimes had big ideas that have turned out to be good ideas. The Green Deal, as announced, is ambitious, and it provides, I think, green shoots of hope, and has some great ideas behind it that can be leveraged into good developments. So what is it? The Green Deal is the idea that we can transition to a circular economy, increase resource efficiency, address climate change, and have a socially fair transition. Now, of course, this is all made a bit more complicated by all sorts of things, such as there is no clear definition of what is sustainability. There are different phrases of it and descriptions by the UN and by other organizations. But I think we all know what we mean when we basically say we've got one planet. It's the only one we've got for the time being and for the foreseeable future. And however we treat it now, it has to last for a bit longer, and we should not do anything now that will wreck it for the future generations. At least that's a sort of interpretation of a definition. So it covers pretty much everything that we can think about. And things that cover just about everything, just like corruption covers just about everything, needs multiple approaches and policy coherence. And I think this comes back to something that Nikos said. We haven't got policy coherence on a grand scale. Multilateralism works sometimes, but not in the way that it was perhaps once seen as being the big savior. So policy coherence, perhaps at the EU level, is possible because of the way the EU works. But even there's some room for things going wrong, but at least there's the ambition. So I think if we think of in terms of what are good examples, where can there be hope? I think if we look at how the EU is approaching the Green Deal and the will to bring together different collaborators, different companies to have more dialogue, to grow this idea in different institutions, is actually a really good one and gives grounds for hope. Now, other countries and national governments will do their part and will have to do their part, because what the Green Deal will end up being, very probably, is a mixture of coercive measures. So there'll be laws and regulations and directives and stuff the EU puts out. And then there'll be incentives, perhaps. Incentives could be tax related. They could be negative in the sense of charges on companies. Governments might also promote self-regulation by companies and foster that approach. And of course, at the end of it all, what I'm keen on to promote, and I know that you are, Tayfun, is collective action. So companies coming together, collaborating, addressing all sorts of issues, not just corruption, but environmental problems, human rights, because they all intersect. As we know, all these things are related. There needs to be more coherence. And these things are being recognized as related, and therefore something we all need to do something about. So these are the things that I think are hopeful. The recognition that action needs to be taken, that joining things together is going to take place, and there are examples of it occurring. And companies don't need to use fancy catchphrases or slogans. They just need to do things and get together with others to deliver. And having joined with companies, either in their own sector or more broadly, and then together with governments, I think there's the potential there for great change. Just one more word on this, and then I'll stop and talk too much. The EU has talked about looking at sustainability agreements in the context of competition law. Now, this is an area of some sensitivity in that clearly sometimes companies want to behave in a way that will make them conform to sustainability norms and ideas, reduce plastics, join together with other companies to look at how to develop green technology, whatever it might be. Some of those agreements or aims at merging together with others might start breaching competition laws. Now, the EU has recognized that and said, let's look at that and discuss how we can make sure that we don't undermine the whole Green Deal through competition law. The Netherlands has gone a step further already and has issued a draft paper. And it's a really interesting, very short document that sets out with examples of how companies can act together in a way that promotes sustainable products or sustainable approaches, and looking at whether they breach competition law. By coming together and giving all these good examples of good practices of how companies can make changes, I think are constructive approaches to changing the way we behave and the way that we've behaved in the past. So just some thoughts there to perhaps try and counterbalance Nikos's bleak picture of the world. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Gemma. Well, I have a final question for you. We have put all our weight on the shoulders of the companies. But as we know, this is a game played by two parties: the governments, the regulators, the lawmakers, and the companies. And above those countries and the lawmakers, there are intergovernmental and international bodies or initiatives like OECD and UN and G20, and to some extent B20, of course, with their pressure. Well, I know that you are very active in the global compliance community and platforms like OECD, B20, and UN. Can you give us your insights about their work? How do the leading brains in sustainability and compliance working in those platforms plan on leading us to a better future?
Well, I wish I could look inside their brains and tell you that answer straight away. So all I can tell you again is perhaps my little corner of experience within these organizations. And I think there's some fantastically good work going on within some of those organizations about how to solve some of the world's problems. It was interesting to me to look at the B20 Japan paper that came out of the Integrity Task Force there. And in fact, there's quite a long paragraph in that in 2019, the paper that came out that said everybody should prepare for a pandemic. Now, the sad part is, of course, that these were calls that were made before the pandemic, and They were pretty clear, but did people follow them? Probably not, because who wants to save for a rainy day when you can spend for a sunny one right now? So yeah, there's lots of good stuff coming out, and how can we really implement it and make it operational and real? And that is a challenge. I do believe that is quite hard. What else are they doing? I think that the B20 in Italy, the presidency of the G20 this year is with Italy, has reconstituted an integrity and compliance task force. Collective action has been very much at the forefront last year in the B20 in Saudi Arabia. I hope that it will be equally supported in the B20 and taken up by the anti-corruption working group at the G20 level, but we'll have to push for that and lobby and hope that it will be taken notice of, because everybody speaks about all of these problems as being only solved through collaborative approaches, and collective action is a method to achieve that. So those are some of the ideas. We've also got an idea that has come out of the B20 process in Argentina, has been picked up by the OECD, and we're supporting it, and it's compliance without borders. Mm-hmm. The idea that the private sector, and the private sector is probably, some companies at least, quite well developed in anti-corruption compliance, fair competition and so on, have good experience with that, and to go and mentor state-owned enterprises. The idea originally was that they would actually go personally in-house and get an experience from both sides, so that the person from the private sector, from compliance, would go and spend some time in a state-owned enterprise and help and mentor their compliance program. Of course, this was all shelved through COVID, and we had hoped to pilot it, and we've got parties on both sides, state-owned enterprises and the private sector, keen to engage, but finding the right partners to marry up and so on is not easy. And we've had some almost pilots, but not quite got there yet. But the compliance without borders is a nice idea. It's how can we help state-owned enterprises? What can the private sector contribute? And we all have to start somewhere. So these are the nice starting points, I think. So yeah, the digital transition, that's another huge area that we will see probably more of in the future. And with the pandemic and everybody working from home and cyber attacks and everything else, I think that what we will see is a huge step forward in compliance and digital ethics. And this will be a new area of interest and development as we go forward. And I think that these organizations at the international level will probably play a role in some of those standard setting ideas, perhaps together with the private sector. At least I hope so. But those are just a couple of examples that I've heard about and I'm familiar with. And there are many more, I'm sure. Yeah.
We all hope so. Well, Gemma, we are approaching the end of our time. While we had this nice conversation with you and discussion, of course, the floor was open for questions. We have received 7 of them and already answered 6. This last one deserves not an answer, but a full panel. But I will ask you anyway. Will this shift in the capitalism, shift in the paradigm shift in capitalism, be valid for the developing countries? Yes, no, and if yes, how will it affect the third world countries? Could you please enlighten us?
I love the way you give me these easy questions all the time.
Well, I said it deserves not an answer, but a full panel. But let's
start. So I guess one way of looking at way things develop in the world, and those that feel like they might be further behind, is that you can leap forward. And if you look in some countries in terms of the way that technology, instead of going through the processes that some of us went through with technology, they just jump into the where are we now? Perhaps this transition in capitalism, if it is a transition, is actually an opportunity for developing countries and companies in developing countries. So I was talking this morning to a company in India, and I would even hesitate to say that India is a developing country.
Exactly. Really,
the perception, yeah. And I was listening to how they were talking about an area of procurement, and I was thinking that's way ahead of many European countries. And so it was interesting. So this notion of, is part of the world going to get left behind? Actually, there's the opportunity to overtake, I think, without being too sweeping and generalizing. Sure, there's always a risk of people and populations being left behind. And that's an important element to think about in government policy. And that's why policy coherence, in the true sense, is important, that we recognize that not everybody is going to benefit from prosperity that comes with digital progress and so on. So, yeah, it's about making sure that these things are looked at in the round.
Well, thank you, Gemma. It has been a privilege sharing ideas with you, learning from your experience. Now we have to go back to the studio and reach the end of the day.
Thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you, Nishihan.